All right. And we are live once again. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we host another monthly installment in our retirement and inheritance webinar series from Unchained Capital. I'm Connor Dolan. I am a director on our client solutions team, and I will be helping assist in hosting the discussion today. I am joined once again by my counterpart, Jeff Vandrew, who is our head of retirement and inheritance at Unchained Capital. Now, today we are Thank you for joining, Jeff. Today, we are discussing a topic that is near and dear to our hearts here at Unchained Capital, privacy. And more specifically, how to think about privacy in the context of public records as a Bitcoiner. Now, for those that may be unfamiliar with what we do, Unchained Capital is the premier Bitcoin native financial services company. And we focus on helping our clients not only custody their own Bitcoin and be their own bank, but also layer financial services on top of that custody model, like personal and institutional vaults, Bitcoin IRAs, Bitcoin-backed loans, and our trading desk. Now, at Unchained, we believe that privacy and security go hand in hand, and our goal is to offer solutions that offer a balance between both, helping you secure your Bitcoin in a fault-tolerant manner, but also doing so while being mindful of privacy and public information. It really is a balance between both, in our opinion, because at the end of the day, there's no point in going all in on privacy if you don't secure your Bitcoin keys properly and end up losing your entire stack. Now, we'll dive a bit deeper into our platform here in a bit, but if you're interested in learning more, you can set up time to speak with a member of our client solutions team by clicking the link that's popped up on your screen if you're watching live, or just by visiting unchained.com and clicking the schedule a consultation button. Now, in just a moment, I am going to be passing over to Jeff here to really dive into the presentation today. But before I do, a few quick housekeeping items. As a reminder, these webinars are recorded and a replay will be made available on our YouTube channel in about a week. The replay to this webinar can also be watched directly through the Livestorm link if you are watching live, and should be played, available to be watched shortly after this session. Additionally, if you'd like, you can download this presentation deck within the Livestorm webinar platform by going to the presentation window in the top right corner and clicking that little cloud icon. And most importantly, as always with these discussions, we have a Q&A at the end where you can leverage the opportunity to ask Jeff questions directly. You can do so by submitting questions in the bottom right corner of the Livestorm platform. There is a questions box. Please make sure to submit any questions you have within that field. And within that field, you can also go in and vote for questions that you would like answered. Now, with that said, let's take a look at the agenda for today's discussion. So in a minute here, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff. And first, we're going to walk through a high-level overview of public records privacy and the information that we should be thinking about trying to protect. Then Jeff is going to talk through the different ways that information can be accessed and what to be mindful of. Jeff's also going to talk through the aspect of public privacy, specifically within the context of Bitcoin ownership. And we'll talk through how you can actually utilize the Unchained Capital platform to assist in your privacy endeavors. And then, of course, the Q&A at the end. We'll always leave time at the end for an opportunity to ask questions live. I'm really excited for this discussion today. I do think it's an important one. And Jeff, you always seem to surprise me with the in-depth knowledge you have on these topics that it seems like no one else is really talking about. So really excited to have you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll kick things off with a question to you. I realize it's a big question to unpack, and it's probably going to bleed into every aspect of our discussion today. But to kick things off, Bitcoin or no Bitcoin, what are the main concerns that someone should be thinking about when it comes to public privacy?
Yeah, so we're not going to address everything here today, but the way that I like to think about this are, there are a few different levels that you might be trying to protect from, right? So you may be in the boat where you don't want other people to know that you own any Bitcoin at all, So for people like me or people like you, Connor, that's not possible, right? Because we work in the industry. Part of what we do is letting people know that we own Bitcoin, educating people about Bitcoin, things of that nature. But there are people out there for which this is a possibility. Sometimes, however, even if you're, let's say you don't work in the Bitcoin industry, you might get exposed as a Bitcoin owner for reasons out of your hands. So for instance, the common example would be a hack. If you were to, let's say, buy your Bitcoin on an exchange, it be hacked. You bought a hardware wallet under your own name. Their database is, they don't have good security. They're hacked. That information can get out there, without you wanting it to. So that's why I often say the larger concern is anything that ties your name to your home address. Because it's one thing if people know that you're a Bitcoin owner by name, that's one thing. But it's much worse if that name is also tied to a physical address. And there's a host of reasons for that. But the one that I think about most frequently is the $5 wrench attack. So for those, who are listening today that aren't familiar with the concept of a $5 wrench attack, one of the things that I think Bitcoiners, particularly new Bitcoiners, don't think about enough when they're thinking about their security is they overly focus on, some sort of like, technical compromise. Someone could obtain my hardware wallet when I'm not around and break through my password, or someone could, some other method. If you're using a hot wallet, right, then it's pretty easy to see how that type of thing might go. To me, those are actually probably the easier ones to protect against, particularly if you're using a service like Unchained, where there's not one single point of failure. The tougher thing that you really want, that I think about more frequently, I should say, is the $5 wrench attack. And that is where someone physically attacks you in order to make you give up your keys, right? Because even if you don't have physical access to your keys in that situation, you'd still not rather be in that boat, right? Because losing your Bitcoin is only one of your concerns there. Your physical health and well-being is the larger concern. And for those unfamiliar with the term, it's called a $5 wrench attack because there's a little meme where, someone's preparing for some sophisticated, very expensive hack. And instead, someone just breaks in their house with a $5 wrench, right, and attacks them. And that's actually how they end up losing their Bitcoin. So the most efficient way to prevent against a $5 wrench attack is just not to have your physical address be something that can be easily found by someone with bad intent. Now, when we talk about this sort of thing, it's important to know that there are trade-offs. So there are some sorts of public records that are easy to get yourself out of. It's easy to shield your address out of them. It's easy and it's cheap. There are other types of records where it's more expensive to plug that hole or plug that privacy leak. So you've really got to think about where your personal line is. Some people are just going to want to eliminate the really easy to plug privacy leaks. And the good news about that is, as we're going to talk about in a little bit, the easy to plug privacy leaks tend to be the ones that are most accessible and most searchable by someone with bad intent with the least amount of effort. The stuff that's harder to search requires a little more effort on the part of a third party to find out. Sometimes that's more difficult and expensive to get yourself out of those databases. So that's a very personal decision. And what I hope to sort of provide you here today is more or less a list of the types of things that you should be worried about, ways that you can shield your privacy from those specific types of public records or databases, and an idea of what the costs involved are. And when I say costs, I'm talking not only about financial costs, but also we'll say PIA costs, things that are just like frustrating, difficult, annoying, for you to actually participate in. So again, this sort of just touches on that again. The two types of concerns we're going to be addressing here are public records that reveal your home address and public records that reveal that you actually own Bitcoin. If you're, and this second one, as we mentioned, is only really a concern for people who are not like Connor and I, people who are not broadcasting to the world that they have Bitcoin.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Jeff. In this next section, I think you're going to jump into all things searchable records, and I'm really curious to get into this part of the discussion because I think a lot of people have questions, and it's just this big black box in terms of what that actually looks like. So, to jump into this next section, if someone had a vendetta against Connor Dolan, maybe private investigator Jeff Andrews going after him, what are the public records that they'd have access to, and what's the information that's available to them?
Yeah, and that's, by the way, you inadvertently there brought up a great point. Private investigators, it's one of the things we're going to talk about in a little bit. They actually have access by virtue of their licensing to certain records that regular people do not. So that's another thing to think about. Like if someone is more motivated and they're willing to pay for a private investigator, there's certain types of records that they can potentially access that just an average person who's not willing to incur that cost of a private investigator is able to access. So yeah, I mean, here are some, some basic public records that reveal your address. This is probably not exhaustive, but these are the ones that I think about most frequently. Voting records, which are essentially the biggest privacy leak there is. Property tax appraisal records in some states, that's called a property tax assessor records. That's also a huge leak. Those are really easy to search. Pretty much every appraiser or assessor in every county in the country just posts that. A very, very convenient and easily searchable database on their website. Slightly less accessible are going to be deeds and mortgages, which are recorded publicly by the county clerk, or in some states, they actually have a county deed recorder separate from the clerk, but it's the same concept. Next level would be your driving records, because those are going to be tied to your home address. The access there is a lot more limited, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then one often people don't think about a lot is the USPS mail forwarding service. We'll get more into that, once we get to that slide, but that's a pretty easily accessible database of names and addresses of lots and lots of people. So voting records, when you register to vote, your name and home address become publicly available. In every state that I'm aware of, this is the case. It's like part of the deal. There are websites. So normally, to get those records, you have to go to the county or state. You pay a small reproduction fee, and they generate for you. Nowadays, it used to be in printouts. Nowadays, it's like in a digital format, a list of all the registered voters with names and addresses. And the political parties use that a lot, for instance, for a host of reasons. They want to know who's registered in their district. Have they voted yet? They can get voting history, too, from that, which is useful to them. For reasons I don't understand, I guess these guys like to be jerks. There are people that pay the nominal fee to get that information and then just post it on websites, like privately run websites. These aren't even government run websites. There's just random dudes that just go to, say, Texas, pay the nominal fee to get those electronic records and then just turn it into a database that they post on their website. Really not a nice thing to do, but that's a thing people do. I guess anything that gets eyeballs to your website, I guess, gets you some advertising dollars, and I presume that's why they do it. So on one level, this is a really easy privacy leak to plug. You cannot register to vote. There's a downside to that in that you can't vote, but you are not required to register to vote. In most states have motor voter laws now, meaning when you go to get your driver's license, they automatically register you to vote. However, every state which I'm aware of, when you go to get your license, has an opt-out. Usually it's like on a little screen in front of you, at least in my experience. You can click a button to opt out of registering to vote when you go to obtain your driver's license. So that is one method. The other method is you can register to vote, but do so through what most states refer to as an address confidentiality program. This may or may not be hard for you to get into depending on the state you're in. And I give two examples here of states that are kind of at like opposite ends of the spectrum on this. Texas's address confidentiality program is terrible. It's like nearly impossible to get in. It's essentially only public officials and domestic violence victims, and that's it. So if you're not, a judge or, an elected official or other type, other type of elected official, or I think police might be eligible for it, or you're not literally on record as being the victim of a domestic violence crime. And I think in Texas, that means like you actually have to have filed charges, if I'm not mistaken. In Texas, you're pretty much not going to be able to get into that address confidentiality program. Florida is much broader. The number of different ways you can get address confidentiality in Florida is so long. It's like multiple pages of check boxes with boxes that you can check. Just any witness to public violence in Florida, you don't need like proof that you were a victim or anything. You have to sign an affidavit saying that you're not lying about it. That gets you on there. All firemen and EMTs, even if like you're not like actively working as a fireman or an EMT, if you're just certified to be a fireman or an EMT, that can get you address confidentiality. Former government employees, the list goes on and on and on and on and on in Florida. So like if you're in a state like that, even if you don't think that it's likely that you qualify for one of these address confidentiality programs, you might be surprised depending on your state. And, if you're someone that really cares about voting a lot, you might just, it's a lot of effort, but if you really care about voting and you really want your address confidential, in a state like Florida, you can just go to school to become an EMT, even if you never intend to work and do that. That qualifies you. So, you really have to, this is one you have to research. If you want your address out of there and you do care about being able to have the right to vote, this is a situation where you're going to have to do your research.
Thanks for walking through this, Jeff. And I imagine this question probably applies to a couple of different slides here, but I'm curious, is this something that can be done retroactively, or is this something that you have to be mindful of from the very first time you're getting your driver's license or your very first time that you're deciding to vote?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can do it at any time and you'll be blocked out of the address database going forward. The problem is these guys that do these websites often have stale databases on their website. So if you were at any time in the public record, or if you were in the public record at the time they paid to download that database, you're not going to get purged from their website just because you're out of the state's database. So it only protects you prospectively. The best practice is when you move. So when you move, you have a huge opportunity because you're starting fresh, right? So when you move, you want to jump in and you want to, be proactive and never have that new address in the voting database, period.
Cool. Thanks for walking through that.
Yeah. So the next type of record that we have to think about are going to be property tax appraiser records, or like in some states, it's called the property tax assessor. These are publicly searchable and tie your name to your address. You can put someone's name in there. All the property that they own in that county or state will show up, and it will tell you the assessed value of the property. It'll tell you all kinds of interesting information. So one way is you can get into a state's address confidentiality program. That's typically the same eligibility standards for voting. The good news here, though, is if you're not eligible for address confidentiality in the appraiser records, you can still get your name out of there by deeding your home into a trust or LLC, because then the trust or LLC's name will appear in the appraiser records instead of yours. So the trustee, usually if you're deeding into a trust, just something to keep in mind, in most states, the trustee's name will stay in the public record. So you may want to use a third-party trustee. That could be a friend. In some states, there are professional land trust trustee companies that will do that for a few $100s a year. They just act as nominal trustee in the public record for you. So that's, just keep that in mind when you're executing a deed. The good news is by federal law, if your property is less than 4 units, your house, which most people live in either single family house or at least a house less than a quadruplex, including a condo. If you only own 1 unit in a condo, that's still single family for this purpose. In that situation, you can deed your property out of your name into a trust so long as the trust entitles you to retain occupancy. And by federal law, the mortgage company essentially cannot raise an issue over that. They can't call your mortgage due and payable. There's nothing they can do about it. You're allowed to do it. If you use an LLC instead of a trust, you don't get that same level of protection. So when it comes to residential property with your actual residence, typically people are going to use the trust for this purpose instead of an LLC. The second reason people are going to typically use a trust as opposed to an LLC for this purpose is in states that have a homestead exemption. Usually you can keep your homestead exemption if your house is in trust. You usually lose it if it's in an LLC. For those who aren't familiar with homestead exemptions, there's usually in most states two parts to it. Number one, you get some creditor protection for something that legally qualifies as your homestead, meaning if someone sues you and you lose that lawsuit, they can't seize your house. And then number two, you might get some reduction in your property taxes as well if something is your legal primary homestead. That varies state to state, of course, but just sort of speaking with a broad brush here. We spoke about the mortgage issues, using a trust as opposed to an LLC. In some states, notably, I think it's just Florida and Illinois, there is this concept of a land trust. There's nothing special about a land trust versus any other kind of trust for this privacy purpose. Land trust statutes just basically the purpose of them is they reduce liability on the trustee. It makes it easier to find a third-party trustee if your state has a land trust statute. But again, if you're not in Illinois or Florida, you don't have to worry about it. You can just use a pretty standard, any old type of vanilla trust for this purpose.
Great. Yeah. And, before we move on to the next slide, and we're going to talk about trusts a couple of times throughout this presentation, including how you can leverage the Unchained Capital platform with your trust. One of the questions we get a lot is, hey, can you all help me set up a trust? And that isn't a service that Unchained Capital provides. But Jeff, do you have any thoughts on if someone was looking to set up a trust, what the best first step would be there?
Yeah, I mean, the key would just be to, engage a qualified estate planning attorney in your area. It kind of has to be someone local to you because it's going to have to be someone that's an attorney licensed in your state of residence. Also, in most states, you can't execute estate planning documents remotely. So a lot of times you're going to have to do it in your lawyer's office. So you typically want someone local to you who just has a lot of experience in estate planning and that you can sort of go sit down and discuss these sorts of issues with.
Excellent. Let's move on to the county clerk.
Yeah, so the county clerk, or what in some states is called the deed recorder. Some states have a separate deed recorder that's separate from the county clerk. They record deeds and mortgages. They're less easily searchable than property tax records, but it's more costly to get your information redacted out of there. And I'll kind of explain what I mean by that. So property tax records are real easy, and a lot of times you can even search at a statewide level. The clerk records, usually you would have to know the county the person lives in, because there's just usually not a centralized state database for that. And secondly, if you search someone's name and a deed pops up, you don't know if that deed is current or not. So you know that person at one point lived there or at one point on that property, but you don't know that they necessarily currently still do. So there is a leak there, but maybe not the biggest leak. So the bigger leak than deeds is actually mortgages, because the issue here is, let's say you're buying a new house and you're moving and you're going to do it in a trust, right? So that you don't end up in the property tax assessor's records. Well, the mortgage company is still going to put your name on the mortgage documents. So when I say mortgage documents, colloquially, we refer in most places to all loans that are secured by real property as a quote unquote mortgage. From a legal perspective, that is wrong. In the majority of states, real property loans are secured by a mortgage, particularly on the East Coast. A mortgage is basically a type of lien that is filed in the public records. That is not how real property loans are secured in states like California and Texas. In California and Texas and like 14 other states, somewhere in that ballpark, you guys don't have mortgages. You may use the word mortgage in a colloquial sense for all real property loans, but your real property loans are secured by what's called a deed of trust, which is legally speaking, a different sort of legal document. It allows for something called a non-judicial foreclosure. But either way, whether we're talking about a legal mortgage or a deed of trust, it's still publicly filed. It's going to have your name on it. If someone types your name in there, it's going to pop up and it's going to have the address of the property on there. So even if your deed is private and you're not in the assessor records due to use of a trust, if you're getting a mortgage, you're giving that up. And that's what I mean by costly to redact. The only way to get out of this one is you're going to have to buy your house in cash. I mean, that's the sad truth here, because all commercial residential lenders, even if you don't have a Fannie Freddie mortgage, like if you're doing a jumbo mortgage, they still follow the Fannie Freddie guidelines and rules. And that's basically means slapping your name on those mortgage documents. You could theoretically find like a private hard money lender, but that's hard to do and a lot more expensive. Getting a commercial mortgage would get you out of this problem, because commercial mortgage does not have such requirements. However, as a condition of obtaining a commercial mortgage, typically the lender is going to make you sign an affidavit whereby you swear under penalty of perjury that you will never live in the property. But the reason the lender does that is because there's different regulations for residential versus commercial mortgages. So, the only real way to go about that there for most people is honestly, unfortunately, you're going to have to buy your home in cash if this is a record that you're worried about. Like I said, the good news here is this is less easily searchable than the property tax records. So if you're not willing to incur the cost of buying a home in cash, you still can deed your existing home, which may or may not have a mortgage on it, into a trust. You're still gaining privacy at the assessor record level, which is not perfect, but still considerably better than having done nothing at all. Something else just to be aware of in the county clerk records is, even if your home was transferred into trust for tax records, if it was transferred from a deed that was originally in your own name, that trail is still going to be in the clerk's records. It's not necessarily going to show up when someone does an assessor search, but it will show up at the county clerk search level. So if you want the strongest level of privacy, you're purchasing the home in trust from the start in cash. Is that realistic for everyone? No, but that would be the most secure way to do it, and doing it from the start. Now, I should say, if you are eligible for address confidentiality under those standards that I mentioned before, which vary state to state, oftentimes in that event, you can get the publicly recorded deed. You can have the address redacted off of the deed by filing a request with the clerk. But again, that's another way to sort of skin this cat. But that could be very easy or very difficult depending on what your job is, what your life history is, and what state you're living in, as we discussed when we were talking about voting records. It's typically going to be the same standards that are used in voting records, meaning if you're in Texas, for instance, that's going to be very difficult. So driving records are going to be another potential privacy leak here. So these are not, by federal law, the Driver's Privacy Protection Act, this is not available to the general public. If I want to go find out where Connor lives, I cannot do that on my own. It is available, however, to certain parties. Auto manufacturers and auto-related businesses are allowed to get that information from the states. Usually that's not a huge problem, but be aware of it. Debt collectors in limited situations are allowed to get that information from the state. The biggest one, though, is private investigators can. Now, when private investigators access otherwise protected driver's records, they do need a certification from you that you're doing it for a valid purpose. But, people can fake that. Usually saying that you're exploring litigation against someone is a good enough reason that a private investigator would be able to access that info. So there is a barrier here with driving records that makes them nowhere near as large of a privacy leak, right? Because someone's got to hire a PI, and they've got to convince the PI that there's a potential here that that they're going to sue you. Usually, it's litigation related. That there's that you've done some wrong to them, and they're trying to find you so that they can serve you with process or something like that. So not a huge privacy leak here, but also if you want perfect privacy, it's something to be aware of. Driving records, you can get in address confidentiality. Again, it's the same, generally in most states, the same standards as voting that we talked about before. So this is the least of all the privacy leaks we've talked about so far due to the Driver's Privacy Protection Act. This is the smallest privacy leak. The only way to avoid it is if you qualify for address confidentiality. Another leak to be aware of, and just because people never think about this one, is the USPS mail forwarding database, right? So there's this old saying in the tech industry that if you're not the customer, you're the product. And what they mean by that is, like, for instance, Google doesn't charge you for search, right? So that means you're the product, not the customer. They use that information they gather from your searches, and that's how they make their money. That's how the Postal Service finances free address forwarding when you move. So everyone who has a change of address request on file with the Postal Service sells that information. So anybody with what's called an NCOA link license can access both your old and new address if you filed a change of address card. Those licenses are not particularly expensive. They can be as low as 10 grand. So that is a thing people can get to. Again, that is kind of a barrier, right? You have to buy an NCOA link license in order to get that information. But this is also just like a very, very easy one to avoid, right? Just don't file a change of address with the Postal Service. There's no rule that you have to do that. You can just reach out to your banks, your credit card companies, do it all on your own to change your own address directly. And then you're covered on that one.
That's it's really interesting, and I guess a little bit terrifying to know how much information is out there and just easily accessible. But we talked through a couple of different things, and I think an important component that we think about from a privacy and security perspective at Unchained is making sure that you're not the low-hanging fruit. And so I'd be curious your thoughts, Jeff, but I imagine just taking the whatever proper steps you can makes you significantly less susceptible than the average person that's not thinking about this. Is that fair to say?
Exactly right. I mean, even if all you do is either don't register to vote or get address confidentiality with voting, and title your house into a trust, which is easy to do even if you have a mortgage. You'll still be discoverable in the clerk's records, but you're going to be light years ahead of 99.999% of the population.
Sure. And I imagine in the Q&A here, we will dive a little bit deeper into maybe some best practices. And just as a reminder, for anyone in the webinar right now, feel free to submit all questions for the Q&A in that bottom right corner in the questions box. And you can also see other questions that have been asked and can vote on them there. So Jeff, we've talked about public records more broadly and addresses and the ability to search for addresses. Now let's talk about maybe a different kind of address and talk about specifically related to Bitcoin. What can someone search about me or find out about me?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So now we're going to talk about public records that may or may not reveal your physical address, but they do tell people that you own Bitcoin and may, in certain situations, may even say how much Bitcoin you own, right? So the two big ones there are probate records and hacked records. So when it comes to hacked records, I mean, this is just a matter of choose your providers wisely. Choose companies like Unchained that have good security practices. When possible, if you're ordering something Bitcoin related, use a PO box, use a mail service address. Mail services, for those that aren't familiar, that's a physical address that you can get as opposed to a PO box, where they can accept FedEx and UPS for you as well as mail. And it also, presents itself as a street address rather than as a PO box. So those are all good security practices to the extent they're possible with a given provider. Probate records are public but not easily searchable. So probate, for those that aren't aware, this is when you die, your will gets recorded in the county where you were, typically your county where you were a resident when you died. And along with that will, typically in some sort of inventory is also recorded, which is like a listing out of all your assets and debts. And those assets, if you own Bitcoin, are going to be one of those assets that are listed out. It's also going to list out all your beneficiaries, their names and addresses. So that's also information you may not want floating around there. The good news is, while that's public, it's not easily searchable. Someone would kind of have to know the county where you died and call the different states have different names for this. Some states call it the surrogate's office. In some states, it's actually through the court. Some states call it the probate office. Pennsylvania, I believe, calls it the widows and orphans office, which is my favorite. You'd have to call and request a copy of the record, and they will send it to you for a nominal fee. But it's not like most states and counties, this is not like a thing where there's like a database where you can just pop a name in over the internet. The good news here is this is very easy to avoid, if you use a revocable living trust as part of your estate plan, which is a very common thing to do for a variety of reasons, not just privacy. And you title your assets to the revocable living trust. Those assets are not part of the probate process, and they do not end up in those public records. So in the context of being an Unchained client, you would want to make sure that you title your Unchained vault to your revocable living trust rather than titling it to yourself personally. And I'm going to turn it over to Connor here. He's going to speak a little bit about that, how that works.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Jeff. So importantly, when we're thinking about an Unchained vault and how to leverage that, I think it's important to discuss what is an Unchained vault. And before we can do that, I do think it's important to just very quickly talk through the idea of holding your own private keys. When we think about privacy within the context of Bitcoin, a core component of Bitcoin, and arguably where it gets a lot of its value from, is this ability to easily custody your Bitcoin completely on your own without relying on a third party. The analogy that's commonly used is it's really akin to individuals that own physical gold or large amounts of cash. But of course, at a certain net worth, when you have too much gold or too much cash, it actually becomes incredibly infeasible to secure that on your own. And what ends up happening is you rely on a third party to do it for you. With Bitcoin, you can secure $10 or $10 million or $10 billion in a commercial grade custody solution for a very minimal cost, especially when you look at the alternatives. And you can do so by holding your own digital private keys. So what does that mean exactly? Well, without getting too deep into the technical weeds, Bitcoin's blockchain is built off of something called public-private key cryptography. Bitcoin lives on addresses, and each address on the Bitcoin network has a public and a private key associated with it. This is true for every address on the Bitcoin network. Even the Bitcoin that you hold on an exchange like Coinbase or Gemini or Kraken or any other, there is a private key tied to that Bitcoin. The only difference is that it's the exchange that owns that private key and not you. So most importantly, whoever holds the private key is the one that ultimately has access to the Bitcoin. And so in our opinion, Bitcoin on an exchange is not really Bitcoin. It's more like a Bitcoin IOU. But what you can do is send Bitcoin to an address that you hold to you hold the private key to by using a device like a Trezor or a Ledger or a Cold Card All of these are different manufacturers that make these hardware wallets that specialize in storing that digital private key for you. Now, the benefit of Bitcoin is that you get to be your own bank using one of these devices, but the downside is that you have to be your own bank security. If you don't do a good job of securing that digital private key, your Bitcoin could be lost forever. And that's why you hear these stories about individuals that have $400 million of Bitcoin sitting in a landfill somewhere. What happened was they lost the private key. But importantly, native to Bitcoin's protocol is the ability to create an address that has multiple private keys associated with it using multiple of these hardware wallets. The benefit of that being I can lose one of my keys and still not lose all of my Bitcoin. And that's ultimately where Unchained Capital comes in. So what we do at Unchained Capital is help clients build addresses on the Bitcoin network that have multiple keys associated with them. These are called multi-signature custody addresses. And more specifically, what we're doing is building what's called a 2 of 3 multi-signature address, meaning there are 3 private keys associated with a given address. And in order to access the Bitcoin, you need any 2 of those 3 keys. We structure that so that we hold 1 key and you hold 2 keys in the form of 2 hardware wallets and, of course, their seed phrases. The way to think about this, you can see the visual on the screen. It's really kind of like a digital safety deposit box that has 3 keyholes, 3 keys, and you need any 2 of those keys to open that safety deposit box and access the Bitcoin. We only have 1 key. We're like the banker, except we can't drill into your safety deposit box if we really wanted to. We only have 1 key. All we can do is help you access the Bitcoin. We cannot access the Bitcoin ourselves. And importantly, you have 2 keys. You have unilateral access to the Bitcoin, whether or not we're around or not. But importantly, if you were to ever lose one of your keys or misplace or it was stolen or whatever it may be, your Bitcoin is not at risk of being lost forever. As long as you have your second key or the seed phrase safely secured, you can use your key and our key to access the Bitcoin. Now, every address on our platform is structured this way. And the broader idea of our platform is that with 1 login, 1 username and password, and 2 of these hardware wallets, you can build as many of these 2 of 3 addresses as you'd like with different contexts. So you can build a 2 of 3 address for my personal Bitcoin, and then I can build a 2 of 3 address for a vault for my IRA and roll over assets from a 401k or transfer assets from an IRA into real Bitcoin that you hold the keys to. And importantly, you can also build vaults on behalf of entities like a trust. And so what Jeff was referring to from a privacy standpoint, you have the ability to create one of these 2 of 3 addresses on our platform on behalf of a trust without revealing your personal address. You're using your trust's address, and any Bitcoin that is owned on behalf of that trust, you can set up in this 2 of 3 structure where you have unilateral control of the Bitcoin with your 2 keys, but you're not on an island. We're walking you through the process of getting set up, and we're here as a backup in case one of your keys were to ever be lost. Now, if this sounds overwhelming, not to worry. We have a concierge onboarding service that you can sign up for that will walk you through every step of the process from setting up the devices to building your vault. And you can even order hardware wallets through us if you don't have any on your own. You need 2 hardware wallets, and our platform works with Trezor, Ledger, and Cold Card. If you are interested in going through that process, certainly feel free to set up time with our team, and we'd be happy to speak with you. You can click on the consultation link that was popped up on the screen a little bit earlier, or you can go to unchained.com and click schedule a consultation to speak with a member of our team. Now, with that, I think that leads right into our Q&A for the discussion today. And Jeff, I had a question personally that I was interested in. We've talked a lot about the different information out there, the different records out there. I'd be curious from your experience, what is the biggest mistake that people make when it comes to public privacy or public records?
They don't think about it from the start, right? So there are people out there who bought their home cash, but which is like a huge opportunity, but they didn't from the very beginning say take title in trust rather than in their own name. And which means they didn't take full advantage of the opportunity that was presented to them in that scenario. So that's one big thing, is like every time you move, you have a brand new opportunity to get privacy. So just always have that in mind. Even if you don't have perfect privacy today, right now, if you aren't, if you're going to move at any time, you don't know when you might move in the future. That's like a fresh start, right? So you're at a fresh start. You've got a big opportunity, and make sure you take advantage of that opportunity. I think that's the biggest mistake most people make.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up question to that, but we do have a question in the queue here. This one comes from Dan. Best practice is to use a new wallet address for every Bitcoin transfer. How can this be done with an Unchained vault? You're absolutely right. That is certainly a best practice that is regarded within the space, to use a new deposit address for each deposit that you make. Now, within the current platform at Unchained Capital, currently there isn't a new deposit address generated each time, but rather when a spend is completed. That said, that will be changing here very soon as we've continue to improve and upgrade our platform. So you will have the ability for manual address change to have that new deposit address every single time in the near future here. But until that point, what you can do, if you are interested in having a new deposit address for every deposit that you make to an Unchained vault, you have the ability with these two hardware wallets to build as many vaults on our platform as you'd like. So even within your personal account, you don't just need one personal vault. You can have 5 personal vaults. You can have 50 personal vaults if you really wanted to. And so if you really wanted that new deposit address every single time, that's what you could do. But we will have an update to our platform here in the near future that will make that even easier and cleaner for you. Jeff, going back to that question and talking about best practices, if I think about next steps, and I potentially have a move here myself in the near future, and this could be a good opportunity to start implementing some best practices that I clearly have not done up to this point. What should I be thinking about, as to maybe summarize the conversation and the presentation that we ran through? What are the main things I should be thinking about if I have a move coming up over the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, so very simple. Don't register to vote until you figure out that you can get into an address confidentiality program. If you do want to register to vote, when you get your driver's license, be sure to opt out. Even if you are going to eventually register, opt out at the DMV, because you need to separately register if you want to register under address confidentiality. Number two, think about potential ways that you might be able, if you're going to be renting, you don't have to worry about it. If you're going to be buying, think about potential ways that you could buy cash, right? Even if not truly cash. For instance, there are companies now that will give you unsecured, what they call home improvement loans, for up to 100 grand, depending on your credit and your income. So that's not going to buy a house probably for 100 grand, but if you're a little short, something like that might get you over the finish line, right? Private loans, that's not going to be possible for most people, but think about it. And look, if it's not possible, I'm not telling you to not buy a house unless you can buy it in cash. I'm just saying, be aware of the trade-offs there, right? Most people are not going to have the ability to buy a house in cash, but what you can at least do is, as soon as you take title, immediately flip title out of your name into that revocable living trust, so you're at least covered at the property tax assessor level. And then the last thing is, of course, don't file a change of address card. Just do the legwork and reach out to the people yourself, and give them the new address. And for a lot of those people, you might not want to give them, everybody you give your address to is a potential leak, right? If they're hacked. So for a lot of those people that you don't need to give your real home address to, consider like a mail service. So if you have a PO box, a lot of those companies will also require a physical address. But if you have a physical address mail service, even one of the ones that just scans all your mail for you, which is convenient too, a lot of times that's sufficient for a lot of those providers. So think about who you want to have your home address and who you don't want to have your home address. And for those people that you don't want to have your home address, consider getting a mail service. They're not that expensive.
Great. Have another question in the queue here from Hassan. And I believe you really addressed this at the beginning, but I think it's a good reminder here at the end of the discussion as well. Hassan was asking, isn't this unnecessary if purchasing non-KYC Bitcoin? I'd be curious your thoughts on that.
Well, not really, because if anyone, only if no one knows that you have any Bitcoin, right? Because most of what we talked about today is not really about keeping your records that you own Bitcoin out. It's more so in the context of keeping records that tie your name to your address. So if there's no one that knows that you're a person that has Bitcoin and you're able to keep it that way, then yeah, that may be the case, that you're not concerned about your name being publicly tied to where you sleep at night. But if you're a Bitcoin developer, or or you work in the industry, or you've just talked about it to people broadly, there's people out there that know you own Bitcoin, and as a result, you may not want your home address to be tied to your name in a very public way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one additional thing to add there, we working at Unchained Capital, we work with clients all the time that certainly have it sounds like they have non-KYC Bitcoin. But at the end of the day, it is becoming harder and harder to escape the clutches of KYC. And more importantly, most people have a mix. If they do have non-KYC Bitcoin, they likely have some KYC Bitcoin as well. And so ultimately, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing type solution from a custody perspective. And Jeff, to your point, it has nothing to do with the fact that your physical address is out there and could make you susceptible to attacks.
That's exactly right.
Excellent. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for this thorough presentation. I think it's a really important discussion that not enough people focus on, and I appreciate you taking the time to have these discussions and make them available, because I do think it's really important information. If I think of how we view this balance between privacy and security, I will go back to a point I made earlier. We do think there's an important balance between privacy and security, because at the end of the day, you can be as private as you want to, but if you don't have the right custody solution to save your Bitcoin for the next however many decades, well, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter about privacy if you're not secure enough and you have nothing to be private about. So with that being said, if you are interested or have any questions about Unchained Capital's platform and how we can help you hold your own keys, how we can help you set up a 2 of 3 address specifically in regards to like a revocable living trust, certainly don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can go to unchained.com and schedule a consultation with our team. You can reach out to me directly at connor@unchained.com. And of course, we are always here to offer support. With that said, we'll wrap up the discussion today. Jeff, thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone here for joining, and we'll see you next month.